Well, thank you. I don't know that I've had such a round of applause before. Good evening and welcome. My name is Jeff Tomlinson. I'm the director of the Lee County Library. Thank you for being here this evening for a very special program featuring Pulitzer Prize winning author Jon Meacham in conversation with Mayor Jack Reed Jr. Do take a moment. Okay, who is getting his notes? Take a moment to silence your cell phones and any other type of device that could cause some disturbance. I want to say thank you to the Friends of the Library for hosting our reception this evening and for your many good works throughout the year in support of library programs and materials. Thank you. The library is fortunate in its friends, and particularly the friendship of Jack Reed Jr. and the Reed's Gumtree Bookstore. Thank you, Jack, for partnering with us tonight on this program, and also for being such a champion of the library and reading in Lee County. Thank you.
My pleasure.
As you know, our program this evening continues a tradition of excellent programs made possible through the generosity of Mrs. Helen Foster. And many of you know Ms. Foster was one of the very first library board members. She served on the library board from 1941 through 1960. And without her, I don't believe we would have a public library today in Lee County. So she was very instrumental in pushing for public library services in our county, and we're very grateful to her. We do have members of her family with us this evening. Helen Fleming, thank you for being here, and thank you for continuing your family's heritage of supporting the public library. And actually, each of us can help support library programs by making a donation to the Helen Foster Endowment, and you can do that by making your check out to the Lee County Library Foundation and noting Helen Foster Endowment in the memo line, so if you're so moved. Please remain seated after our guest remarks for a special presentation by our Friends Program Chair, Margaret Gratz, immediately following the program. Jack Reed Jr. served as mayor of Tupelo from 2009 through 2013, during which time the city received its 4th All-America City Award. Jack is an honors graduate of Tupelo High and Vanderbilt University. He has given back to our community by serving as chair of the Community Development Foundation, the Mississippi Economic Council, and the Downtown Tupelo Main Street Association. He has served as president of R.W. Reed Company since 1987. He is the co-chair of the Tupelo Reads Committee, an initiative of Mayor Shelton's Task Force on Education, and is a member of Create Foundation's Board of Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Jack Reed Jr.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I didn't know that was part of the program, but at least it was short. You know, the most interesting introduction John ever had when I was mayor was after a candlelight service at our church one Christmas Eve. We'd come out, and you know how you feel fuzzy with the candles and light coming out of the sanctuary. And the lady said, I'd love for you to meet my daughter. She's here from Minneapolis. And she said, honey, this is Tupelo's mayor, Mayor Jack Daniels. And I said, you know, either you're thinking about what you're going to be putting in that eggnog as soon as you get home, or...
Are y'all Episcopalians?
We may need to be.
Yeah.
We may need to be. I know you are.
That would work. Yeah, exactly. That would work.
I know you are. Well, I want to echo just quickly Jeff's thank yous to the library staff and to Jeff for making this possible tonight, and to our staff at Reed's for working extra hard to basically transport the bookstore over to here so we can accommodate all of our friends in Tupelo. And I wanted to thank, although she's not here, but I wanted to publicly thank Reed's champion at Random House, a woman named Barbara Fillon,
Yeah.
who is a friend of ours. And if somebody asked me in a very pleasant way, how in the hell did you get Jon Meacham? And I said, because he's only 24 cities on this national tour. And I said, well, hopefully we were gracious the last 2 times he came. And I said, but really, I said, our daughter Kirk was friends when she was in New York with Barbara Fillon, who is the most important person at Random House in scheduling.
She's a Memphis girl.
Absolutely, she's
Yeah.
in Tennessee.
Yeah, she's a recovering Memphin.
So anyway, I want to publicly thank Barbara for championing us, and hope you'll send her
I will.
regards.
I will. She'll love that.
Tell her she was mentioned here. Well, this is only the second time that we've ever moved an event from our bookstore to the library. The other time was January 18th, 2005, when we celebrated Reed's 100th anniversary. And I hope when you see him next week in Charlottesville that you will tell John Grisham he's now in good company.
I will do that. I will do that. I talked to John today, actually. Yeah, you got to tell a quick story.
Yeah, absolutely. You're the reason we're here.
So first of all, I'm underdressed, obviously.
I'm trying to sell ties for Father's Day.
Yeah.
People say you don't wear ties on Father's Day, but we've got a beautiful set.
I'm Mr. Mayor, I'm actually more worried about the jacket. And Gratz is back there looking like Matlock. So you can tell you're in Mississippi. Years ago, some of you may have heard the story before, but it continues to give. I told the story at Mrs. Bush's funeral a couple of months ago. I was at the National Book Festival in the Washington Mall, and a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough, and said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, you know." Existentially speaking, that's hard to argue. And she said, "Would you wait right here? I just admire you so much. I want to go buy your new book and have you sign it." And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I stood there thinking, this is exactly the way the world is supposed to be. Women are supposed to run up to you. They're supposed to admire you. This is it. She brought back Grisham's latest novel. So whenever I think I have the world right where I want it, I remind myself that somewhere in America there's a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury.
I was going to ask you which
yeah, and I decided to sign it. But the next day, true story, next day I'm in Maine. I was working on the book about President Bush, and it was actually for some reason just the 3 of us at lunch, which is unusual. In Bush world, usually the Oak Ridge boys are there, and the presiding bishop and Billy Graham and some fishermen. It's just always crazy. But it was just the 3 of us, and I told this story, and Mrs. Bush looks across the table, and I'm expecting some motherly reassurance, and she says, "How do you think poor John Grisham would feel? He's a very handsome man." So
that hurts.
It hurt. It was a bad weekend for me. I was 0 for 2.
That hurts.
And then Grisham just called me the other week and said that Renee had just gotten a note, a sympathy note, because some viewer had thought that I was speaking at Grisham's funeral. So he said, "I'm worried about my readers." Yeah, exactly.
You're a national eulogist. Well, you did do a beautiful job at her funeral, by the way, those of us who got to see that. And you may have also seen John, of course, see him all the time on commentaries on whatever subjects, but since this book has come out, he's just been on all the shows. I've seen him from, Willie Geist to Meet the Press with Chuck Todd to PBS with
Judy.
Christina Amanpour.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't see that, but that was probably with her too. The most interesting one I saw, and I sat through the whole hour, was with Washington Journal, the call-in show.
That's the damnedest thing. It's, actually having contact with the public is a very dangerous thing. But the wonderful thing about C-SPAN call-in shows is when you're on Eastern time, and of course it's live, and there'll be someone calling from California. You're like, oh, and it's a 6 a.m. show. So this is somebody who's in prison, or who has not gone to bed yet. So it's always touch and go.
Well, I was going to say that one of my humorous moments of that was when somebody from Nashville
That's right.
called to say, and this person, unfortunately, was a critic of yours, not a...
I think that's a gentle way to put it, Mr. Mayor. I can see why you were in politics.
And after his conversation, he said, And why don't you just get the hell back to that liberal Vanderbilt University where you were a professor?
Right,
Keep
right.
your opinions to yourself.
Right. Well, the way I remember it was a woman who was mad at me about something.
Maybe she had a deep voice.
And she said, yeah, well, you're obviously out of office, I can see. She said, I'm just so glad that my grandchildren don't go to that awful liberal school, Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, well, I went to Sewanee, where Jack Daniels was my best friend, actually.
Well, we are delighted to have you. We're delighted to have you here. And just FYI for the rest of the crowd, I mean, his tour, in addition to Tupelo, started, I think, the New York Historical Society, or at least one of the first ones there. And then he's been to the Carter Center in Atlanta, the World Affairs Council in Houston, that's Houston, Texas, and it ends at the Free Library in Philadelphia.
That's right.
So really, our library in Tupelo, we feel very fortunate to have you, and I just want to congratulate you on the book before we go any further in the conversation. I think it's terrific. I read the first 150 pages without stopping, and it deserves to be in the canon of American histories. It really does. So thank you.
Thank you
For that.
Usually there's a but coming.
No, there's no.
But thank you.
And I don't. Some people may say I'm a butt, but I don't say that about myself. So, all right. For those of us who haven't heard you before talk about the book, briefly, what did inspire
It was, I was working on a biography of James and Dolly Madison, and then the events in Charlottesville last August unfolded, where the President of the United States had a hard time deciding whether he was on the side of the mainstream of the country or the KKK. And I thought that's probably not a good place to be, to say the least. And I get questioned all the time about, the two questions I hear most are, has it ever been like this? And then the second question is, how do we get out of it? And so I wanted to answer the first and try to compare this moment to past hours in the life of the nation that felt insuperable and contentious and difficult in the same way this moment does. And one of the things that's at once dispiriting and inspiring is to realize that chaos is actually the rule, not the exception. More often than not, people are unhappy with the way things are going in the country. And so to recover that, to explain that history did not begin on the day Donald Trump became president. He doesn't like hearing that, but it really didn't. And so there are a number of issues that are perennial, of which he is the most vivid manifestation. Isolationism is perennial, nativism is perennial, xenophobia is perennial, but they ebb and they flow as the life of the nation unfolds. And I thought that not that looking back gives us a kind of GPS. It's not that you look back and you think, all right, here are the three things we can do to do X or Y. But it can give us a sense of proportion. And it can give us a sense of at what point when we're thinking about setting our hair on fire after a certain tweet or something else, should we at least wait a few minutes for the next tweet to do it? And I think proportion is the great gift that history can give us, a sense of perspective. How serious is this? How have we dealt with things in the past? What are the habits of heart and mind that enable us to continue to move forward? Because for a nation that's only 250 years old or so, we have made an extraordinary amount of progress. And every generation has managed to make things a little bit better, sometimes a lot better. We are at risk at the moment of becoming the first to leave things in a worse position than we found it. And so it's a serious moment, and it requires serious thinking about how do we get here, how do we overcome it in the past, and so what can we do about it?
Well, I think you've obviously, and you've touched a lot of people just in the response already in the first month it's been out. We appreciate a historian's perspective in trying to understand the present. So thank you for that
Well, appreciate it.
opportunity. I know you said this is not, and don't want it to be a political book as such. It's more of the, as you said, look back and then look.
Well, what I find is people know what they think about this guy. You know, there's not a lot of people on the fence. You know, you know, do I like him or not? You know, there's not a lot of that. And so, and I guess we have, right, the last 6 Democrats in Mississippi are here tonight. Is that right? Yeah, exactly, yeah. It's good, it's good.
Well, and I was going to say in this audience, I'm sure there's some people very proudly voted for President Trump and some that still do. So.
I'm sure there are, but I wonder about the proudly, actually, because, I'm not being funny, because a vote for, and I should say, I have voted for Democrats and Republicans. I plan to continue to do so. I'm not, people think I'm a partisan because of the network I'm on, but I'm really not. I grew up thinking that Ronald Reagan had created Rushmore. You know, I've been lucky enough to be, you know, to be President Bush's biographer. I'm writing a book in the fullness of time about George W. Bush. He's cooperating with me in the same way his father did.
Wow.
So, you know, I'm not Karl Marx here. That said, if you voted for President Trump, you believed that the country was in a serious shape and required a radical kind of surgery. This was not a, hey, let's just, you know, he's a pretty interesting guy, let's just try it. I mean, that was a conscious, radical vote to send him to power. No matter, and that's just a clinical observation. And I think it's one of the reasons that things have continued to feel so contentious is both sides of this divide believe we're in an existential struggle for the life of the country. And the reason I called this the soul of America actually is I get uncomfortable when people on one side or the other, if the other side's winning, they say, you know what, they've taken over my country. That's not America. The hell it's not America. Donald Trump is as much America as Dr. King. And every era is defined by which side wins out. And I don't need to tell Mississippians this, you know better than almost anybody in the country, that we are capable of great good and great evil, often within 20 minutes of each other.
Yeah.
And that's the soul of the country. And then what we fight for are the moments where our better angels win out.
Well, I thought one of the things that I got from the book pretty clearly is it's taken both presidents and elected officials, and it's taken ordinary citizens to help us get through these times. I thought maybe just to kind of whet the appetite of the folks who haven't gotten to read the book yet, I might just, since you're a presidential historian, just mention 3 or 4 of the presidents that you spent a good bit of time on the book, and just give a, 2 or 3 or 4 sentence kind of summary of where they fit in, and then just, again, not to take away the joy of reading the book, but why don't we start with Abraham Lincoln?
Not a bad job. If you're sworn in and half your country's in rebellion, and when you leave office, it's back together and on its way to becoming a continental nation, pretty good, pretty well done. The two great assassinations in American history of presidents, Ford's Theater and Dallas, are both particularly tragic because both those men, both President Lincoln and President Kennedy, were self-evidently learning on the job. And that's really hard to do, no matter what the job is. Yeah. Being mayor, running a business, anything. Because once you get to a position of responsibility over others, almost all of your intellectual and emotional capital is going out, right? Because everybody wants something from you at every point. You're always the most important encounter they're going to have that day, though you're going to have 100 of them. And so it's an exhausting to be in office, to be in authority. And so it's really hard to learn. Lincoln began his presidency being anti-slavery, but not being willing to use the power of his office to take on slavery. Go read the first inaugural. He says, you have nothing to fear from me if it exists where it exists at the moment. He slowly got to emancipation, and I suspect Reconstruction would have been slightly happier. It couldn't have been much more unhappy if he had survived. Same with President Kennedy. He authorizes the Bay of Pigs right after he's sworn in. Total disaster. He asks Eisenhower for help. Eisenhower explains that you have to have a more formalized decision-making process. Cut to October 1962, when we face the most dangerous hour in human history, and we get out of it, not least because Kennedy was learning. And so I think when we look at Lincoln in particular, the idea that there's someone who could grow and change while under that immense pressure of not only being president, but a wartime president, is really remarkable.
I know in one of your interviews, somebody asked you, said, well, have we ever been this divided before as we are now? And you said, well, the Civil War was...
Fort Sumter was pretty bad, yeah.
So that is...
I mean, it's true. It's true. I mean, Sean Hannity or Armed Rebellion, I mean, it's, All
right. This president, because I'm proud to say, and I'm sure you know this, but his presidential library is now in Starkville, Mississippi. President Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah.
Some Bulldog fans out there.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Is the Starkville Chamber of Commerce here?
Well, we are proud to have his presidential library.
And rightly. Grant had a good moment as president. He cracked down on the Klan in 71. He didn't fully undertake, truth compels us to say, he did allow the beginnings of Jim Crow to take root. But he did far more than his predecessor did, and several of his successors, in order to trying to establish federal authority and really to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. Every generation of Americans has done better the more it has more generously interpreted the Jeffersonian assertion of equality. And that's not an ideological point, it's just simply the case that we become the strongest nation in the history of the world the more broadly we've opened our arms. It's not a partisan point. We became the most powerful nation in history in August of 1945. We continue to be. The largest Air Force in the world is the United States Air Force. Do you know what the second is? The United States Navies. We're doing just fine, So this idea that there's this flow of diversity and immigrants that are undermining our strength is just wrong. And so trying to face the world with confidence, to embrace what the Wall Street Journal editorial page would say, the free flow of people, ideas, goods, so that the Adam Smith vision of the world of commerce and competition can lift everyone, is where we should be. And Grant, I think, believed in the capacity of the self-made man. He was that. Yeah. He's one of the many people in history who, at the age of 40, you would never have bet. Harry Truman's like that, Dante, Ronald Reagan, at the age of 40, was out of work. But at 40, he was selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis. And within 5 years, he was the most famous general in the world. That's a very American story. And Grant believed in that, what Lincoln would call the right to rise up.
Got a couple more presidents to go through. Teddy Roosevelt.
He proves that it is possible to start at the top. No problem there.
Not even third base.
No. He was all the way around to home. A sickly boy, almost died a couple of times, asthmatic, was beaten up on a train going up to a summer camp, which made him decide that he would never again be beaten up, sort of like Scarlett O'Hara. He was never going to be hungry again. And so his father hired one of the great heavyweight champions to teach him how to box. So that's a nice way to do it. So he began to associate physical strength with moral fiber. He believed in a diverse country as long as the immigrants assimilated. And in fact, one of the things I found in doing this book that I didn't know was that the play, well, first of all, the melting pot, the phrase, comes from a play written, published in 1908, and the author of the play, a man named Israel Zangwill, dedicated it to TR because TR was so much about, he didn't want, as he put it, hyphenated Americans. He didn't want Irish Americans, Italian Americans, he wanted Americans. And that was, while he was hardly perfect on many of these issues, he did invite Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, which enraged states like yours and mine. But in fact, he said that the ferocity of the reaction proved to him how important it had been to do it.
Yeah. Well, Franklin Roosevelt.
FDR, I think, is probably behind Lincoln, our greatest president. He came to Tupelo, so he must be.
Absolutely.
Let's keep politics being low. If you had won the Second World War or managed the Depression, if you just done one of those things, you would be in the ranks of the great. To have done both, and to have done both from a wheelchair, is something that I think we don't appreciate so much. But imagine being, here's another one, 39 years old. He was the brightest young politician in the Democratic Party in 1921. He'd been nominated as vice president in 1920. He was the front runner in many ways to be the presidential nominee in 24. And he wakes up one morning and he can't walk. And most people would not have been able to have put their lives back together, but he did. And it was said after he died that he sat taller than most men stood. And I think that's true.
Yeah. One more, Harry Truman.
Truman's like Grant in that you wouldn't have bet on him coming through in the way he did. April 12th, 1945, he's drinking bourbon with Sam Rayburn, which just means the sun was up. Mrs. Roosevelt sends word through Steve Early, the White House press secretary, that he needs to come to the White House immediately. He begins to intuit what's going on. He walks in, she says, Harry, the president has died. And he says, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you? And she says, no, Mr. President, the question is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now. And I mean, imagine becoming president of the United States in April of 1945. You're 3 weeks away, 18 days away from Hitler killing himself, 3 weeks away from VE Day. You don't know much about the atomic bomb, if at all. It's kind of a debate about that. You certainly don't know if it's going to work. You think you'll have to invade the home islands of Japan. A mind-boggling number of casualties would have been required. And then you have to rebuild the world. And you know that the last great Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, had been driven to his grave trying to rebuild the world. And you do all this, and you're a border state senator who'd been put on the ticket because FDR wanted to put Jimmy Burns on the ticket, but he couldn't put a segregationist. The New England liberals wouldn't put up with it. And so Truman was just kind of there. And I think to do the Marshall Plan, which was really the Truman Plan, but he said, we're going to call it the Marshall Plan because if we call it the Truman Plan, nobody will be for it. Not many politicians would do that. In fact, almost none. And I think his work on race is underappreciated. He was the first president to address the NAACP. In his library, there's the fourth draft of his speech, and he has a line about wanting to ensure rights for all Americans. And he had this wonderful spiky handwriting. And he writes, it's typewritten, but then he's gone in and says, and when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. And he underlines all, and it bleeds through the page. And he wasn't perfect, but when he became president, he saw his duty whole.
And he was a failure at running a men's store,
He was.
which shows you this is a tougher job than you may think. it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And he didn't even have to deal with Amazon, believe me.
Yeah. I don't know how many royal blue jackets he had.
Well,
but,
he'd-
yeah.
You know, John, I don't want to get too bad on you for your taste in clothes, but this is a very fine, beautiful I had several women here, unlike your deal with John Grisham, who've told me they thought this was beautiful.
Is that right?
And
Were they- were they the-
they asked me for your autograph.
I was going to say, yeah. They were looking in the large print section.
Well, it's a large check. It's a large check.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That was pretty good.
All right, thank you. Well, all right, this is something maybe
Back to highbrow stuff.
you may not have been asking some of y'all. I've tried to come up with some things that you have been on the road for a while. This is a year, particularly when women have been asked to speak up and stand up about things. I was proud and didn't know as much about, although I knew a little bit about the courage that Senator Margaret Chase Smith showed in the McCarthy era, when a lot of men didn't have the guts to say anything. And I think it was the Declaration of Conscience on the Senate floor. Tell us, share that with us.
Yeah, Joe McCarthy gives his initial red hunting speech on Lincoln's birthday, so what, February 12th, 1950, in Wheeling, West Virginia. He was not a significant national figure. The fact that he was speaking in Wheeling, West Virginia was a sign of that. It was a low-tier market, but he was out doing it. And Senator Smith from Maine, immediately understood where this was going and gave a remarkable speech about how accusations without proof, without due process, without the rule of law were fundamentally un-American. And she got 6 co-signers in 1950. McCarthy dismissed them as Snow White and the 6 Dwarfs. But 4 years later, and it took the men about 4 years to catch up, she ended up she was right. I mean, the censure happened. I do think of the 2 periods that are most like our own at the moment, I think it is the 1920s with the rise of the Second Klan and the 50s with McCarthy. McCarthy, like Trump, is a freelance political performer. McCarthy bought anti-communism, Roy Cohn said, his own lawyer, the way other people might buy a car. There were communists in the government, but Harry Truman had taken care of most of them in a program that people wouldn't have liked much, civil libertarians. But he understood how to play the press in a really fundamental way. He understood afternoon newspaper deadlines. He would call in the afternoon papers at about 11:30 in the morning. They closed at noon. He would say, "I am seeking a communist in Des Moines," or someplace. And they wouldn't have time to check it. So they would run out and file it, because here was a United States senator saying that communists were running around Des Moines. Cut to 11:30 p.m. when the morning newspapers were closing, and he would call them in and say, "They've eluded me in Des Moines, but I'm redoubling my efforts." So then they would flash out, redoubled efforts. And it just went on. It's a little bit like Twitter. It's a little bit like cable news. It was just a constant serialized drama. And McCarthy understood it intuitively in the way the president understands not just social media, but I think he's president not least because he understands the vernacular of reality television. He understands how to keep an audience interested in a way that is really unparalleled. And great politicians, important politicians, are the ones who master the means of communication of their time. Jefferson and Lincoln could write quickly and well. Roosevelt and Churchill understood the radio. Kennedy and Reagan understood television. Bill Clinton understood cable early on. Remember when he went on Arsenio Hall and played the saxophone?
Yeah.
George Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Yale. He had no idea, And Trump understands how to sort of keep everything dramatic. And one of his tells, I'd love to play poker with Trump. One of his tells is whenever he says, "We're going to have more on that soon," he's just making it up.
Well, just one P.S. on Mark J. Smith. I think Senator Susan Collins of Maine is a courageous woman in the Senate now. She's willing to speak her own mind.
She is. She's a nice woman, smart woman.
All right, race, our nation's original sin, certainly in Mississippi and the South and Tennessee. You write a lot about LBJ and the Civil Rights Act. I think one of the things here in Tupelo we are proud of, and we've got our own problems too in Mississippi still. We've still got the state flag to deal with and other things like that. But Tupelo has, I think, dealt forthrightly with a lot of the race relations issues. Nettie Davis, who is here, Ms. Davis right there, our first woman in African-American city council, head of our city council, was sat in at Fisk University in Nashville, one of the ground crew that Martin Luther King talked about that made that possible. We've got our city park. I was there playing tennis last week. I saw an African-American, and African-American in this case was from Nigeria, now a U.S. citizen, teaching a white kid. I saw our white pro teaching a black kid. I saw these black and white children playing together in the splash pad. Tupelo has always been the most, I think, progressive city on race in Mississippi, and one of the ones in the South. So we are trying, and we still got a ways to go, like we all do. But talk a little bit about how just the man in the moment with LBJ and the Civil Rights Act.
Well, as you say, and you alluded to it earlier too, one of the great questions about the history of any republic is, to what extent does change come from the top, and to what extent is the top simply ratifying change that is made possible from below? And it's the latter is mostly the case. Without Rosa Parks, without Diane Nash, without the people, without John Lewis, without Alice Paul during the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, without the initial American revolutionaries, without the founding fathers. These were people who saw the world as it was, but wanted to make it something different. And they created the conditions through their courage and their witness for the established powers to actually make that shift a part of custom and of law. But it began far from the centers of power. It began in the streets. It began at Fisk. It began, Alice Paul went to England to learn from the suffragists over there who endured force feedings that, believe me, if you read about them at Guantanamo, you'd be outraged, which is what would happen to the women who wanted the vote, which, by the way, we're not at a century yet where women have been able to vote in the United States. You know, we're at barely the 50-year mark in terms of the Voting Rights Act, where I think this month marks the 3rd anniversary of the marriage equality decision. You know, this is an unfolding story. It's a perennial struggle. And my sense is, with Johnson, is like Truman, Johnson took the fact of his national election, in his case as vice president, as a moment to move beyond his sectional views. As a senator from Texas, he had not been a friend of civil rights, but he gave a speech at Gettysburg. I mean, imagine a politician going to give a speech at Gettysburg. That's, pressure's on. That's a fairly venerable place. He said, we keep saying patience, but the people saying patience aren't the ones whose rights are being denied. Mm-hmm. And then it's really one of the most remarkable moments in presidential history. President Kennedy is killed at 1 p.m. or so Central Time in Dallas. Johnson is back in Washington, in bed in his house in Northwest Washington that night. He's giving a list. His aides, of course, are all in the bedroom with him. At least they weren't in the bathroom, which also happened. And he was giving these orders, who should be called in, what should happen with the funeral, what foreign leaders had to be contacted. And he said, I want to call the leadership and get the Civil Rights Bill, which President Kennedy had proposed after the stand in the schoolhouse door in June of '63 over in Tuscaloosa. I want this passed, and I'm not going to change a comma. And his aide said, Mr. President, you've got an election coming up. People didn't know Barry Goldwater was only going to carry 6 states at the time. Why were Kennedy and Johnson in Texas? Do you remember? Because there was a split in the Texas Democratic Party between the conservatives under John Conley and the populist liberals under Ralph Yarborough. And there was and John Tower had become the first Republican from Texas since Reconstruction, had won Johnson's seat when Johnson became vice president. And there was a bright young man who'd spent a lot of time in Midland and had just moved to Houston, who was going to be the Republican nominee in 1964 for the Senate seat. And that was George Herbert Walker Bush. The reason Kennedy and Johnson were there was to put the Democratic Party back together so that there weren't 2 Republican senators from Texas. So it was not a foreordained thing at all. And so for Johnson to say, I'm going to push the Civil Rights Act no matter what, was an act of remarkable personal political courage. And he didn't change anything. And he pushed it through, and the country's better off for it.
I had the opportunity, since we knew you were on a busy schedule today. This is John's 3rd appearance today, and he's leaving, going to travel to Jackson tonight after he signs books for us here. So we knew we weren't going to have time for questions for the audience, but I did ask some of the people that had come in the bookstore to buy your book, so what would be 1 or 2 of the things that you'd be curious about? And one of them that I thought was particularly interesting was this. You just got back from Greece. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus has said that character is destiny. We hear that from high school. You hear it in college. You hear it in speeches. Character is destiny. Character is destiny. How do you look at our president now, and then the other, just how much does that hold true as a historian through America's life?
It's totally true. I think it's the most important thing in ways you can't really know on the front end. We've talked about a couple of them. Abraham Lincoln was my God, how many races did he lose before he became president? Truman, you wouldn't have bet on. Johnson, you wouldn't have bet on. It's a remarkable fact of history that the character of the person who's sitting in the position of ultimate responsibility matters enormously. It's why elections matter. And and the testing is almost always unforeseen. My favorite example of this is President Bush, again, the senior President Bush, who is the most empathetic, most generous man you can imagine. And I'll tell you a quick story about someone you've never heard of, named Bennett Mcnichol. Bennett Mcnichol was a classmate of President Bush's at Greenwich Country Day School in the 1930s. He was a fairly rotund lad. There was an annual obstacle course race at Greenwich Country Day School, and George Bush always won. So in his last year before he went off to Andover, the faculty asked him to give everybody else a head start, and then he would start. He said yes, of course. So everybody runs off. He runs off after a decent interval, and he's going through a series of barrels on the ground as part of the obstacle course, and he looks over to the right as he's coming out, and Bennett Mcnichol is stuck in the barrel. Yeah, it's sad. So what does Poppy Bush do? He pulls him out of the barrel, and he realizes at that point it would be ungentlemanly to beat someone you just helped. So he said, come on, Bennett, we'll finish this together. And they finished together. It was the greatest moment of Bennett Mcnichol's life because he tied George Bush in the annual obstacle course race. I didn't hear that story from a Bush. I heard it from a McNichol. And when I took it to the president, I said, I just heard this story about Bennett Mcnichol. I swear to God. He said, Bennett, he loved lunch. Mr. President, that's not the point. He says, Bennett's still big. I said, Mr. President, that's not the point. That's the point. All right, cut to November. It's a sweet story, right? That's right. Cut to November 1989. George Herbert Walker Bush is now the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the leader of the Cold War alliance against the threat of nuclear Armageddon of the Soviet Union. The East German border guards mistakenly start letting travelers through. The Berlin Wall falls. Jack Kennedy always thought that if World War III began, it would begin not in Havana, not in the Pacific, but in Berlin. What does George Bush do? He refuses to go to Berlin. Any other president would have gone to Berlin to declare a great American victory in the long twilight struggle. Bush won't do it. Democrats, the press, everyone's pounding on him. Everyone's saying he doesn't understand. George Bush, at 20 years old, was shot down over the Pacific, lost 2 crewmates, and at 20 wrote his first Gold Star letter. He understood just fine what was going on. He was thinking about somebody who was stuck in a barrel. He was thinking about Mikhail Gorbachev, who had a hardcore right wing that did not want to see Soviet greatness go away, that did not want to see Russian greatness go away. And if you doubt me, if you think I'm overstating this, I refer you to a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin, who was part of that right wing. Bush knew that if he went to Berlin, he would be complicating Gorbachev's life. And he saw that things were on a glide path to a peaceful end to the Cold War. And so he pulled Gorbachev out of the barrel. It was one of the 2 significant moments at the end of the Cold War. And I didn't hear that line of analysis from a Bush or a Baker or a Scowcroft. I heard it from Gorbachev, who said that that was one of the 2 biggest moments he had experienced, is the way Bush let him breathe at that moment. That is entirely about character.
Absolutely. And he's come to Tupelo. George Bush.
Well, there you go.
Tupelo, so.
Can I tell you one more story?
Yeah, absolutely.
One more story about Bush and Trump and all that. This is not in any way relevant, but it's funny. It's sort of funny. I mean, it's sort of relevant. So, you know, people ask me a lot, you know, who is Trump most like? And and Trump most wants to be like Andrew Jackson. And, you know, I knew Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a friend of mine. And so in March of 2017, the president announces that he's coming down to the Hermitage in Nashville, where I live, to lay a wreath at Jackson's tomb, 250th birthday. And one of the fun things about presidents is always listen when they talk about their predecessors, because presidents tend to see as they wish to be seen. So whenever they mention someone, they're trying to be in that zone. So I'm sitting at home and I'm thinking I should do something. Right? So I write an open letter to the President Trump, saying that, you know, if you're going to embrace Andrew Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts. And there are obviously plenty of crazy parts, right? Jackson once said that his only 2 regrets in public life were that he had not hung Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and shot John C. Calhoun, his own vice president. We now know that no one felt that way about their running mate until John McCain. But anyway, so I write this letter saying, you know, embrace Jackson's sense of union, blah, blah, blah. And it runs in the local newspaper. It's the entire front page of the paper. And it had no effect, whatever. But the next day, I'm walking into lunch, and my phone rings, and it's President Bush. And his staff had shown him this piece. And he said, how you doing? I said, I'm fine, Mr. President. Dana Carvey once said the key to doing President Bush's voice was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. I said, I'm fine, sir. How are you? He said, I'm fine. He said, I read your letter to Jackson. I thought, ooh, the old boy's losing it, right? I mean, he thinks I'm writing letters to dead people. And I said, thank you, sir. I'm glad you're feeling better. Mr. President, actually, it was a letter to Trump about Jackson. And without missing a beat, the old man said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention.
Well, there you go. You got a courtesy laugh anyway. All right. Out of respect for your time, and people do want to get their book signed, they didn't get a chance to. Just a couple more. And this is just on point. One of the things that appeals to me about leaders are ones that have both a sense of humor and humility.
Yep.
Who are some of the, through your history, it doesn't necessarily have to be through just the Soul of America, but all of your work, who have you admired that has matched that sense of humor and humility? I guess maybe a self-deprecating sense of humor, and George H.W. Bush certainly is a great example.
President Reagan was very funny and never made other people the butt of the joke. Reagan was very careful about that. Winston Churchill is hilarious. Best Churchill story is, this is the only thing you'll remember from this whole evening, so get ready.
Maybe my coat. Maybe they'll remember.
Well, there's that. Yeah. Hard to forget.
On sale at our watermelon sale next year.
That's right. I want to cut.
Yeah.
Churchill is in the men's room of the House of Commons, and a long trough of a urinal, and he's standing there, and Clement Attlee comes in, the Labor Prime Minister, a socialist, and Churchill moves away from him. And Attlee looks at him and says, feeling standoffish today, Winston? And Churchill said, no, it's just that every time you see something big, you want to nationalize it. Really relevant. But I told you, that's all you're going to remember.
That's what we've been waiting for. That's
Yeah.
why you're here. That's the kind of inside politics we're interested in.
See if McCullough would tell you that.
All right.
Go on, Mr. Mayor, you can do it.
Yeah, I'm going to skip a couple others. Maybe back to one serious thing, then one final thing. This is the Bible Belt. We're part of it. You're Nashville, certainly, too. And a lot of us in the audience tonight are people of faith, and different faiths perhaps, but you talk a lot about in the book about hope as being one of the, we fear, we want hope. The call to worship in our service where I go to church this past Sunday, the scripture was about the woman who had touched Jesus' garment and was healed. And the congregation, our call to worship, said, we come as a people of faith yearning to touch the hem of hope. I know you are a religious scholar too, and I know religion is important to all of us. How do you think, whatever religion we practice, how do you think that can inform and empower us as we seek to be part of the answer to our country's finding our soul in our battle for our better angels?
I think it's vital, and I think that it has an enormous amount to offer the life of the Republic. It's not a popular answer, perhaps, on the broad center-left, but the religious virtues of compassion, of empathy, of reaching out as opposed to closing one's fist, of welcoming the stranger, welcoming the wayfarer, are political and civic virtues. And I don't know quite where else they're being inculcated and taught except in religious institutions. So I think it's absolutely vital. The thing we have to watch always is the tendency to self-righteousness or feeling that anything we do is right because we believe it's divinely ordained. So the role of humility, which you mentioned a moment ago, is absolutely essential. But more and more, I think that religious folks have an enormous civic duty to be involved and to try to embody and enact those dispositions of heart and mind, not of self-certitude, but because my own view, again, I'm an Episcopalian, we sort of count, is that faith is far more mysterious than it is magical. That is, the older I get, the less I understand. And I think that fundamentalism ultimately is for the insecure. If you're not comfortable with ambiguity, then you're probably seeking certitude and really trying to adapt an entire worldview to your own purposes. And I think that's dangerous. But I have no doubt that in an age where civic virtue is absolutely essential to trying to overcome this tribalism, this you pick one team and you can't say anything good about the other team, that's a very dangerous place for the country to be. And I think the religious impulse can be important. And I also think the most fundamental part of the American experience is the founding itself was an act of reason. It was an attempt to give reason a chance to stand in the arena with passion. And if you think about what was going on in the 200 or 300 years running into the American Revolution, it was the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformations, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, Gutenberg, the democratization of information, the rise of the bourgeoisie, the entire reorientation of the world from being seen as vertical, where popes and princes and prelates and kings had authority by either an accident of birth or an incident of election over all of us, to a more horizontal understanding, that we were born with the capacity to decide what we believed and what we would do. And the American Revolution was the great embodiment of that shift. I think it's the most important thing that happened in Western culture since Constantine converted to Christianity. And if we don't use reason, if we don't listen to the other team and see whether they have anything worth hearing, then we're not being true to that fundamental American insight.
Wow. All right. Brilliant. I probably could have said it better myself. Last question. What is your your readership? What do we have to look forward to from Jon Meacham? What are you working on?
Oh,
what
Lord.
are you thinking about?
I'm going to go back and finish my James and Dolly Madison book, The First Power Couple.
See that as a subtitle.
And thank God for Dolly. She saves the whole thing. They were the most important married couple in the first 50 years or so of American history. And Mrs. Madison really created Washington as we know it. And so my sense is if you write the Constitution and create Washington, you should be better known. And if anybody has any rap lyrics about Madison, I'll be out front.
Well, we have one presentation that Babe Gratz is going to make to Jon, but please join me, and I hope you'll come back when you write that next book.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to go down there. Thank you. We're going to come right down there. Great job.
Uh-oh.
It's priceless.
What did I do?
On behalf of the Friends of the Lee County Library, we bestow an honorary membership
Oh, thank you.
on Jon Meacham.
Thank you, thank you, thank
I know you will put that in a
I will do it.
valuable place. And also as a token of our appreciation for you being here tonight, this is a limited edition print signed by artist Charles Buckley, who created this mural for us
beautiful.
for our 75th anniversary
Thank you.
celebration.
Thank you, thank you, thank
Thank
you.
you for being here.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
Can you over here?
Yeah. Jeff, you want to take him back? Jeff's going to walk him back to the table. Different people have different opportunities. If you just want a book and you had a sign, you've left your name, you can pick it up at the bookstore later. If you haven't gotten to meet John, he's going to stay as long as he said he'd stay as long as y'all were here, but try to respect his time and that he is headed to Jackson. So maybe not too many long stories, but thank you all for coming. I was really, I wasn't apprehensive that we'd have a good crowd, but when you're one of 24 cities in America, and he's been to New York and Atlanta and Houston, and you know, I wanted to make sure that that he knew how much those of us in the flyover country appreciated somebody like him. So thank you all. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you. And we're dismissed. Thank you. Thank you.